How deep is your faith? So in today's lesson, Jesus sends his disciples away, telling them to get into a boat and to sail to the next destination. That was the line I thought I was going to read. But that's what he told them to do. And he needs a break because throughout the day before, he's feeding 5,000, ministering to people, doing all kinds of things. And not only was that amazing, but the day before that, he learned that his dear friend John the Baptist was beheaded. And he did all this work trying to conquer his own hurt, his own pain. And he practiced the peace by, I believe, by first forgiving those who hurt John the Baptist in his heart. That gave him the power to do compassion work for the next day. And anyway, he sends his disciples out. And it's important to remember this team that Jesus has built, what they are trying to do. And Jesus is asking his disciples to, follow him, to do what he says, and, to help him in the ministry. Now, to have faith in his teachings. To have faith. And faith is the belief in the teachings of Jesus, the shalom that leads one into action. As we've talked about before, action is compassion, caring for those who are suffering. Grace is an unearned gift with no strings attached. Forgiveness is the gift of grace after one has been harmed. Justice, fighting for and advocating for the poor and the oppressed. And finally, mercy, the withholding of judgment and giving the benefit of the doubt. This is the totality of his teachings and what his disciples are expected to do, to take that message forward. And now they're taking it forward in a boat, heading to a distant shore. And this morning's lesson, I think, can be seen as a type of a test. They're asked to go on a boat and follow to a distant shore, but the waters of life can get pretty tricky. They can get choppy. They can become threatening. And Jesus, however, gives us and his disciples the tools to stand firm in the faith so that we can, in fact, change the world. This is what Jesus is expecting. Now, in this lesson, one of the things I think is useful to remember is that in ancient Near East literature, water and waves are seen as chaos, a reflection of the ways of the world. And this is kind of a literary device that is used. Matthew minimally uses the sea to frame up the challenges represented to those who are going to follow Jesus into the chaos of this world. The challenges that there are. Now, with that said, if we look at the nature of this, or the site of this particular story, we have the Sea of Galilee, or Lake Gennesaret. It's called either or. The sea is 700 feet below sea level. The sea is 700 foot below sea level, relatively shallow, surrounded by berms and hills with nearby mountains that reach up to about 2,000 feet. All this is nearby. Now, the warmer air below sea level and the colder air coming from the mountains can collide, and it creates lots of action on the Sea of Galilee. And if you are in the midst of such a storm, it can be very scary. But it's not thoroughly unexpected. There are a lot of storms on the Sea of Galilee. Now, to take that and to say, well, where are we going to go with this, or what does it mean to me, when we are challenged with offering this peace that Jesus teaches us to the world, it can be very scary. And too often, Christianity has stood down in the face of those with power and wealth. Too often that's happened. And it creates some real choppy waters because we haven't always stood up. Now you see, power and wealth is great if it fully subordinates itself to the peace. Then it's good. But it has to subordinate itself to the peace so it can leverage its power to make life better for all of humanity. Now, it doesn't happen much, and consequently we have a context of very choppy waters, a lot of pain and suffering that isn't necessary. And of course, talking about the peace and talking truth to power is ultimately what gets Jesus killed, because those with power and wealth saw him as a threat. As a threat. So, when the drive for power and wealth defeats the peace, which it often does, this is when chaos and war will always follow. Choppy waters. Yet at the same time, there are others that use their power to establish a community of common ground with radical concern for all people. That's happening too in our midst. But there is this tension in all of this that can continue, I say, to lead to choppy waters. And that's the way it is. It's scary to follow this peace to its full conclusion. Now, in biblical times, there were all kinds of instances of people of power turning away from God, all kinds of instances. We have Judas Iscariot, who he did have power, and he turns away, right, by selling himself out for 30 pieces of silver. We have Demas, a companion of Paul, who abandoned the ministry to seek riches and power. He was in a great position in Paul's ministry, but he decides, I've had enough. This is not enough, and so he moves forward. King Solomon, as wealthy and as wise as he was, he's led into the worship of other gods toward the end of his time. And in some ways, Peter today is sort of kind of striking out on his own as well. He wants to walk on the water to go to Jesus. He wants to do this, and he gets out of the boat. And, of course, he starts to sink. Now, everybody else in the boat did what they were told. They stayed in the boat as Jesus had commanded them, and they were doing that, but Peter had to break away and do something different. And ultimately, Jesus, he rescues Peter, they get into the boat, and then the sea becomes still. It becomes still. And this is what can happen when the principles of peace are in full play. If we do consistently in all situations follow the teachings of Jesus, things calm down, and you can begin to hear a whole nother aspect of life taking place. Now, last week was a week of some political campaigns and so on, but there was an interesting question posed to one of the Senate candidates last night. It was a Senate candidate from Kansas, and he is the pastor of the largest United Methodist church in the country. And so he shares this story. He says, there's this one guy who came up to me and he said, "Pastor, I have only one question that matters." And he says, "Well, what's that?" "Will you only support policies that love the neighbor?" Now, he understood, right, who the neighbor was. Remember the story of the Good Samaritan and the question ultimately after, what do I have to do to get into heaven and so on. The Good Samaritan story is a demonstration of Jesus ultimately saying, in those words and more, the neighbor is everyone. Everyone's the neighbor. We're talking about God's creation here, folks. And so it's a deep question. Jesus makes it clear that it's never enough to just love our families and neighbors. It is equally important to love all people, even our enemies. And in Luke 6:32, he says, even sinners love their families and friends. That's not what we're doing. That's important. It's very important. But we have to go well beyond the bounds of that. So through the teachings of the peace, we're invited to imagine the things that we do. How much do we conform to that very peace? And in the end, I think this is the question that today's lesson offers, because it's going to be choppy, How do we smooth those waters out ourselves by following the peace? How does that work? It's different for each of us. Now, after the teaching and preaching and acts of compassion and feeding the 5,000, we can have the faith that through Christ we can make a difference in the world. We can have the faith that that is fully possible, but we have to follow Christ. We have to follow Christ. I return to the person who asked the Senate candidate, will you only support policies that love the neighbor? What a transformative question. It's thoroughly possible. Thoroughly possible. Now, winding this up, we're in a political year. You are Christians. And for many in your life, how many people do people know you're a Christian? Do your friends and family know? Do people fundamentally know? Okay, so here's the thing. We are candidates representing Christ. Okay? Candidates representing Christ. So anything we do, anything we say, anything we follow that does not represent the peace the rest of the world knows, because they do understand the ideal type. They get it. And if we don't follow that, we stir up other challenges. So for us, the chance is to let that reflection of faith move forward. And so, let our lives be governed by this simple question. How will I love my neighbor today? And in doing so, we'll follow Jesus. And in doing so, we will smooth out the harsh waters of life. Amen.